Welcome and good afternoon to everybody. I'm Saul Lairfreund. I work for an organisation called the Death Penalty Project in the UK. We're hosting today's side event. We're very pleased to be here at the 42nd session of the United Nations Human Rights Council to present and discuss the findings and recommendations of Baroness Helena Kennedy's deeply disturbing new report, of which you should have copies, on the death penalty and illegal executions in Saudi Arabia. As we'll hear in greater detail shortly from our experts today, the findings of the report are deeply shocking, and the illegal executions that it highlights certainly warrant the full attention of the international community. Very briefly, our organisation, the Death Penalty Project, we're based in London, and for more than 30 years we've been working to promote and protect the human rights of prisoners who face the death penalty. We currently work in over 30 countries, predominantly in common law Commonwealth countries in Asia, Africa and the Caribbean. Our work is supported by a wide team of human rights lawyers, forensic experts and academics, and is fundamentally driven by the belief that the death penalty is cruel and often discriminatory in its application that disproportionately impacts on the poorest and most vulnerable members of society. Before we hear from the panel, I just want to say a few words to place Saudi Arabia within the global context in relation to capital punishment. And as many of you will be aware, over the last 30 years, there's been a significant rapid global movement away from the death penalty. Today, 142 countries around the world, approximately 75% of the world's nations, have abolished the death penalty in law or practice. And the pace of change over the last 30 years has been astonishing, and the global trend is crystal clear. The majority of the world regard the death penalty to be an arbitrary violation of the right to life and a cruel and unusual punishment, and also poor and ineffective criminal justice policy. And this thinking was confirmed last December by the UN General Assembly when they held their biannual resolution calling for a worldwide moratorium on the death penalty. 121 countries supported and voted in favour of this resolution. Interestingly, only 20 countries carried out executions in 2018, with the vast majority concentrated in 4 countries: China, Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And Saudi Arabia is well established as one of the most extreme cases, having executed more than 1,000 people over the last 10 years. Indeed, with the exception of 2010, Saudi Arabia has one of the 4 highest execution rates every year throughout the last decade. With at least 134 citizens and individuals executed in 2019, the regime's death toll is on course to surpass that any previous year on record. As we're about to hear in greater detail from the panel, the shocking violations of human rights in Saudi Arabia go far beyond the simply high numbers of executions. We're going to hear about executions carried out for non-violent crimes, such as political activism, the execution of children, gross violations of the right to due process and a fair trial, mass beheadings and stonings carried out in public. As concerned members of the international community, the findings of this disturbing report are not something we can afford to shy away from. They must be confronted head-on, and I'd like to invite the first member of our panel, Baroness Helena Kennedy. In her absence, we're going to hear from her by video stream. Helena Kennedy is a member of the UK House of Lords and one of the leading human rights barristers in the United Kingdom. She's prepared the report that's before you on the death penalty and illegal executions in Saudi Arabia.
My name is Helena Kennedy, and I was the author of the report which has been presented to you today. Can I start by apologising for not being with you? I really had wanted to come and make this presentation directly, and I want to thank all of you for coming to this session. But the reason why I couldn't be there is because of the burdens of the work that I'm committed to here at the moment this week in London. But I want to start by saying that I was the expert advisor to Agnes Kalamar, the rapporteur on extrajudicial killing, who conducted the inquiry into the death of Jamal Khashoggi. And as a result of going to Turkey, being part of that of her investigation, I was very concerned about the ways in which this was being presented to the world as being some sort of rogue activity and not part of systemic human rights abuses inside Saudi Arabia. And the point of this report is to highlight the extent to which there has actually been an escalation of human rights abuses. The use of the death penalty has increased significantly. The fact that people who actually have been advocates of, for example, reform for women are still in prison. The ways in which people are being treated. The failure to hand over the bodies of the dead to their families. What that does in terms of leaving people with a terrible feeling of being unresolved. The cruelty of the system is so great that this report comes out of a great deal of research by others and it's been drawn together into my report. And I really hope that you will take this report to heart and see if something can be done globally. The undermining of the rule of law, respect for law, the respect for human rights is so great. And the idea that because we all want to trade, that this can be ignored should be a matter of real concern to us. So that's why this report has come into being, is to document the horror of what is currently happening in Saudi Arabia and the ways in which the rest of the world has to be alerted to what's going on and to recognise that by failing to deal with this and speak out about it, we ourselves are undermining the rule of law.
Okay, I'd now like to call upon Baroness Janet Whittaker, to my right, who's a member of the United Kingdom House of Lords and is also an active member of the United Kingdom All-Parliamentary Group on the Abolition of the Death Penalty. Baroness Whittaker will speak on the recommendations from the report and how best to take these forwards.
Thank you. I very much welcome the opportunity to discuss this subject on the basis of my colleague Baroness Kennedy of the Shaw's report. I intend to give a very brief overview of why it's important to do something and what is the sort of actions which parliaments and the international community can take. I'm sure we shall be able to take up these points further in discussion. The report has already received very wide support, both from British parliamentarians and abroad, and there is considerable pressure that can be exerted to press for the implementation of its recommendations, both in the British Parliament and in international parliamentary networks. It is clear that national and international action is necessary. First, to attempt to avert the current intention of the government of Saudi Arabia to execute those listed in paragraph 8 of the report, as well as any others, and there are almost certainly many others under the sentence of death, to condemn the way in which the death penalty has been used with confessions obtained through torture and other clear violations of human rights, and to press again the importance of abolishing the death penalty altogether. The parliamentary means available are well known: action in national parliaments, liaison with international partner bodies such as the Council of Europe, the European Union, for as long as the UK remains a member, the parliamentary network of the World Bank and the IMF, to advocate that members of these parliaments bring pressure to bear on their own governments. United Kingdom parliamentary action takes the form of oral questions of ministers, debates and written questions, the first of these being the fastest to achieve and the easiest to publicise in the media. And I think it's very important that we get as much profile as possible in the mass media, because that too brings pressure to bear on governments. Apart from action by the UK government, parliamentarians can press for the United Kingdom representatives on the relevant United Nations bodies, as listed in paragraph 13 of the report, the committees of the conventions against torture, on the rights of the child, on civil and political rights, as well as the Human Rights Council itself, to take all necessary action vis-à-vis the government of Saudi Arabia, and to ask what representations national members on these organizations have made and will make. In particular, the recommendations in the report that Saudi Arabia should establish a moratorium on all use of the death penalty, and that an independent and politically neutral fact-finding mission should be set up, should be pursued as a matter of urgency, with the sanctions that if the government of Saudi Arabia does not comply, members of the G20 will not attend the 2020 summit in Riyadh, and Saudi Arabia's membership of the Human Rights Council will be suspended. That's just a brief overview, and I think that we can go into detail as you would all like. But in conclusion, I would like to refer to a quotation from the Quran, 1697, cited in the memorial to one of our parliamentary democratic leaders, Lord Ashdown, earlier this week. It is, Allah commands justice, goodness, and generosity. He advises you so that you may take heed. I think we all need to take heed about how we can ensure that these recommendations are all implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now going to be joined by video link, a pre-recorded video from Abdullah Al-Oda, whose father is currently on death row in Saudi Arabia and who has been threatened with execution on many occasions.
Hello, my name is Abdullah Al-Oda. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University and a part-time faculty at the Elite School at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. here. I'm also a legal expert and the son of one of those who are at risk of facing the death penalty in Saudi Arabia. I'm going here to talk about how the death penalty was used by the Saudi government and how the numbers of people executed since King Salman came to power skyrocketed from 27 people executed in 2010, for example. The people who have been executed in 2015 are 158. And while in this year particularly, 134 people have been executed, 37 people have been executed on the same day, another 24 people are at risk of imminent execution, including my father. Now, the case of my father is particularly interesting because they presented 37 charges against him, very bogus charges in a sham trial, charges like having books that are banned in the kingdom, being affiliated with internationally recognized institutions, and having been active in the public sphere and calling to free the arbitrary detainees in the kingdom. This was part of the charges against my father. And other charges like calling for a constitutional monarchy in Saudi Arabia. For the Saudi government, that was an act of terrorism. That's how the Saudi government has been using the idea of terrorism to execute peaceful activists and public figures and intellectuals in Saudi Arabia. The anti-terrorism law in Saudi Arabia facilitates this kind of behavior by the Saudi government. For example, Article 30 in the anti-terrorism law describes any description, anyone who describes the king or the crown prince in a way that defames their justice or religion as an act of terrorism. And in other articles, any way of pressuring the government to do something or to refrain from doing something is an act of terrorism. For example, protests under this definition is an act of terrorism. Many basic rights and liberties that are protected in many parts of the world, democracies and constitutional monarchies around the world are considered acts of terrorism in Saudi Arabia, and therefore people who have done or perceived to having done one of these acts will be tried as terrorists and will be executed because of that. This particular law and this behavior by the Saudi government allowed the government to try two prominent feminists and women human rights defenders like Lujain al-Hudloul and Maysal Amoudi in 2014, and to be tried in the anti-terrorism court in Saudi Arabia, and to be charged with terrorism because they defied the ban on women to drive in Saudi Arabia. This is a blatant example of how terrorism has been misused and abused by the Saudi government, and how the Saudi government at the same time is executing, pressuring, intimidating and imprisoning human rights defenders, activists, intellectuals, and public figures in Saudi Arabia. Now, we have been witnessing the way that the Saudi government acted to imprison and arrest people, but using the death penalty in particular to punish those who peacefully sought to ask for and asked for liberties and basic freedoms in Saudi Arabia is just preposterous and should be held accountable. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'd now like to call on Juliet Wells, who's a barrister, human rights barrister in the United Kingdom, to discuss and talk about the rights and remedies for the families of the victims who are accounted for in this report.
Thank you. Well, as Saul pointed out at the start, Saudi Arabia has gone against the grain in modern times by stepping up its use of the death penalty rather than stepping away from it. But it has also been an outlier, and very much regressively so, in the way in which it carries out the death penalty, and in particular in what it does with the victims' bodies afterwards. And that's what I want to highlight today, and is dealt with in some detail in Baroness Kennedy's report. And the reason I want to touch on this is because, to my mind, it's not just the fact of the death penalty being imposed, or indeed the circumstances in which it is imposed, or even on whom it is imposed, that is the only problem. The problem is also the systematic degradation of the bodies of the victims, the disappearance of their remains, and the total non-observance of their own religious customs. That is a major problem which the international community needs to grapple with. And as I say, Baroness Kennedy's report goes into these themes. And what I want to do is, first of all, dwell for a few moments on the real impact of the three core themes in this area that is brought out in her report. So the first issue highlighted by Baroness Kennedy is the actual administration of the system of carrying out the sentence of death. So in the run-up to an execution, the family will often not be told the whereabouts of their loved one, in what prison they're being held. They often find that their contact with the prisoner is systematically and progressively reduced. They are not given the date or location of a planned execution. Often executions are carried out without family members knowing. And when we consider also the fact that most executions are carried out in public in Saudi Arabia, it is a real affront that the families are not the first to know that their loved one has been killed. And of course, part and parcel of all of this is that the families aren't often afforded an opportunity to say goodbye. To put this in a sort of human context, I suppose, one of the sisters of one of the men who has been identified in the report as currently at risk, the gentleman is Abdullah Abu Al-Khair, and his sister is Zainab Abu Al-Khair. She attended the launch of this report in London in July and gave a short speech. And at the time of that report launch, she hadn't heard from her brother for 2 months, and she gave her speech not knowing at that moment whether he was dead or alive. And the way she described it to me afterwards is a form of psychological torture in itself being inflicted on her and her family on a daily basis, a form of limbo, not knowing what is going on. And that's a theme which I'll pick up on a little later on when talking about the disappearance of the remains of the victims. But certainly that's how she described the not knowing in the run-up to me as a form of limbo. A second major issue which is drawn out in the report is the manner in which executions are being carried out. So executions in Saudi Arabia are unfortunately a deliberately gruesome and degrading affair. They are consistently, almost universally, but not completely universally, carried out in public by way of beheading. And if you glance at the picture on the front of these reports, you will see that that is an image of a cleaner rinsing down Dira Square in Riyadh, which is Riyadh's main square, roughly equivalent to, say, Trafalgar Square in London, following the public executions that take place there almost every Friday after morning prayers. But in a number of cases, Saudi Arabia actually goes further even than this, in that its judges order the crucifixion of certain victims, sometimes as a discretionary measure, sometimes as mandated by Sharia law in accordance with the Hadith. And in this context, crucifixion of victims means that, and I do apologise for the details, but it means that the head of the decapitated victim is sewn back onto the body, and the body is suspended, often in mid-air, in public for days at a time, and frequently allowed to progress to an advanced state of decomposition. It has been known for children to be sentenced to this particular penalty. Most recently, and again this appears in the report, 2 young boys, Shia minority protesters who participated in the Arab Spring and were sentenced to death on account of their participation in those protests, who were under the age of 18 at the time, have both been sentenced to crucifixion and are presently awaiting execution. And their names are Ali al-Nimr and Abdullah al-Zahir. And it is difficult I suspect, for most of us to imagine the turmoil that families go through, the turmoil that the parents of those two young boys will be going through, knowing the treatment that their loved one and their loved one's remains either have undergone or are shortly to undergo. And the third major issue in this sort of particular area that is identified by the report is that frequently, and this is particularly difficult for the families left behind, frequently, on a widespread scale, the Saudi authorities decline to return the bodies of the victims to their families for burial, and indeed the location of burial of the victims of the death penalty is not even disclosed. So not only have they not been able to bury their family member in accordance with their wishes, they have no location to which they can go to mourn appropriately. And this is something which I would suggest should be of utmost concern to the international community, because not only is it torturous for families to have no sense of closure, and this is something that Baroness Kennedy mentioned in her recording just now, and which I suspect many of us in this room will have in mind the words of Haditha Cengiz, Jamal Khashoggi's fiancée, who spoke at the 34th session here in Geneva earlier this year. And again, like Zainab, she spoke of the psychological torture, the sense of being in an unending purgatory, having no sense of closure, not knowing where her loved one's remains are. And that is the fate that these families are consigned to, conceivably for the rest of their lives. But there's not only that human aspect to it. From a more legalistic point of view, the non-return of bodies poses a problem because it frustrates the ability to investigate and hold the authorities to account, where, as is so often the case in these cases, there is suspicion that there has been torture or foul play in the run-up to the execution and as part of the judicial process. And perhaps most worryingly, it appears from the report findings that Saudi Arabia's practice of withholding the remains of victims is deliberately targeted at Shia minority protesters. And that is something which is especially worrying because that is particularly acutely distressing for members of the Shia minority, because it negates their ability to bury their loved ones in accordance with their own religious customs and practices, which happen to place very heavy emphasis on rituals, prayers, and so on that are to take place during the course of burial at the graveside. So it's clear to my mind that the international community simply cannot tolerate these grossly cruel violations of the rights of victims and of their family members. They are very plainly violations of the Article 3 prohibition on inhuman, cruel and degrading treatment and punishment, both of the victim of execution and also of family members. And this is the case on an almost ongoing indefinite basis for the families. And in particular, it's compounded in the case of many Saudi executions by the fact that the conduct amounts to persecution of a religious minority. Of course, there is also the tying into this the aspect of silencing dissent, the fact that much of this conduct appears calculated to terrorize the Saudi population into silence, into not participating in protests, and as I say, to persecute the Shia minority in the east of the country. And with all of that in mind, I want to finish by touching briefly on the remedies that certainly ought to be available to the families of victims. And that redress, of course, ought to, in principle, include compensation, though whether that will ever be forthcoming is anybody's guess. But it also needs to include accountability. It ought to include members of the Saudi regime answering for their direct participation in these violations. It ought to include meaningful change, and that is what many of the report's recommendations are directed towards. And it also must include, tangibly and immediately, the return of the bodies of those whose remains have been disappeared by the Saudi government. In terms of accessing those remedies, it is tolerably clear that there is no realistic prospect of redress internally within Saudi Arabia. Either many of these issues are normalized, even explicitly contemplated by some of the laws which prevail within Saudi Arabia. Some of the executions are illegal even on Saudi Arabia's own terms. But if there are legal remedies in Saudi Arabia, it's also tolerably clear that those cannot realistically be invoked because of the risks to ordinary citizens in Saudi Arabia that would be associated with doing so. So it falls to the international community to do something. And in my view, there are three ways which I want to pick up on briefly that the international community can meaningfully act. First, and this has already been touched on by Baroness Whitaker, is by endorsing the recommendations set out in the report, applying pressure, and so on. Secondly, though, and again from a more legal point of view, countries really ought to take seriously their responsibility to challenge and prosecute individuals for the sort of behaviour I have outlined under the rubric of international jurisdiction. And international jurisdiction prosecutions are often sort of invoked or cited as a nuclear option in this context. But in my view, the kind of violations that I have been talking about today, which arise out of this report, are sufficiently systemic and widespread, but also discriminatory and authoritarian in character, that is an option that should be given serious thought by other countries should the opportunity to prosecute individuals arise. And thirdly, I'd like to just emphasize the utility and importance of the UN's own special procedures, which I think is sometimes overlooked. But particularly there's the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, the Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, on the protection of religious minorities, and so on. And this report has been specifically called to the attention of all of those special procedures. But they have a specific mandate to investigate, to engage directly with Saudi Arabia, to demand redress and answers from Saudi Arabia, and to report back to this council in order to hopefully secure some meaningful change and redress for individuals affected. And as I say, those are avenues which are not to be overlooked. And so I certainly hope that other countries will begin to see these violations, particularly in the context of how the reality of the death penalty plays out in Saudi Arabia, that they will see these violations for what they are. They will recall the words of family members of victims, Abdullah Al-Uda, Zainab, who I mentioned earlier, Hatice Cengiz, and so on. And they'll say enough is enough, and act with the real human cost of these practices in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet, for your very thoughtful, explicit and thought-provoking account. Just before I ask Rodney Dixon to say a few words, I think what you said really surmises why the death penalty will often violate principles of human dignity, and this couldn't be more so than the way the death penalty is practiced in Saudi Arabia. There isn't an element of human dignity that's left standing by the practice that we know takes place, and the need for action internationally, regionally, nationally, and we're going to discuss in other respects is critical at this juncture. So I'm going to pass on to Rodney Dixon, QC, who's a human rights barrister in the UK, who's worked on numerous human rights cases from Saudi Arabia. And Rodney's going to talk about the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia and wider implications from the report.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think it'll come as no surprise to anyone that the UN Human Rights Council, and in particular the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, has for a number of years now in its opinions and findings highlighted gross human rights violations, particularly in detentions and trials in Saudi Arabia. Highlighting first of all that most of the persons who are detained are protesters, opponents, human rights activists, defenders, and journalists. Secondly, that in many of the cases there is systemic ill treatment and torture of persons once detained, where they are denied access to their basic rights, in particular being able to have any access to the outside world, kept in solitary confinement for extended periods of time. And then thirdly, if they are brought to trial, that there are a wide range of fundamental guarantees that are simply ignored in the trial proceedings, very often conducted just as a smokescreen to justify the detention in the first place and then to keep the person detained as well. We've seen all three of these themes highlighted over and over again by the UN in a number of particular cases and then in some more general findings as well. That's the context in which the death penalty is imposed. Very often in countries, almost all the time, those basic violations go hand in hand with the use and abuse of the death penalty. And Saudi Arabia is no stranger to that particularly perilous combination. I just want to today briefly highlight two cases that I've been involved in as a lawyer acting for persons who have been subject to this kind of behavior, to show, based on real evidence, what has happened, and to use their cases really to make a plea for action. It's something that has come directly from them and their families. The first is a report which I worked on with Lord Ken MacDonald, the former Director of Public Prosecutions in the UK, last year, where what we did is based on families and friends of those who had been detained, put together an expert report on what was happening in detention in Saudi Arabia, particularly in September 2017. The reason why we chose that period is because you will remember in October 2018 there were very well publicized detentions of a number of people who were kept in the Ritz Hotel for long periods of time, supposedly trying to clamp down on corruption. Just before that, in September, and in some ways completely then overshadowed by all the CNN focus on what happened thereafter, there was a major crackdown of, we recorded, just over 60 persons. They were mainly political opponents, activists, some female activists, although there were many detained later, and I'll talk a little bit about that afterwards in the second case. But this went largely under the radar, and that's why the families asked us, acting on their behalf, to put out as much information as they had. Many of them didn't want to go public on it. Some did, but we've kept all of the records of their interviews, and that's been made available to whoever has needed it for their own investigations and for the UN as well. But what was most striking about taking forward those cases was just how little information the families, that's both families inside and people outside of Saudi Arabia, had about what was going on. They didn't know when their loved ones or friends had been arrested. They'd suddenly just disappeared. They didn't know where, in most cases, they were being kept until later, in some situations, they were told. But they weren't allowed access to them. In fact, they highlighted that the differential very often between how certain families were treated was quite marked, that some would know, others wouldn't, then they'd be told, then others wouldn't know again. And it went backwards and forwards, almost used as a pressure point against families to keep quiet, not to complain, and as a game, a very sinister game of keeping control over them. But they didn't know what the charges were, what the evidence was, if there was anything, when they were going to be brought before a court, could they see them then? If they did get access, would they be allowed to see them again in a week's time? The complete arbitrary nature of it, but also, and that's what we called the report, shrouded in secrecy. The secrecy of it was quite overwhelming. Piecing together all of the evidence, we were able to look to identify how many people we knew from the families and friends had been detained, where roughly they were or where they'd last been seen, and whether there were any court proceedings going on. That particular crackdown, and there have been many, is quite significant because a number of those people have now come through the so-called system and are facing the death penalty, including Abdullah al-Oda's father, Salman al-Oda, a very prominent progressive cleric in Saudi Arabia. And he has had threats of the death penalty issued against him on a number of occasions, as have many others. It comes and goes as to when it's going to happen, and that kind of manipulation of the system is highly prevalent. So many of those people have been there for a number of years now, either haven't had any charges pressed against them and could be executed or just disappear at any point, or even if there have been sham proceedings, they are potentially facing the death penalty now. There have been many more cases after that, but we examined that particular crackdown because of the timing, as I said, but also because of the types of people who were taken out. It was really a sort of purge of anyone who had been outspoken against the government, and that was a characteristic that came up over and over again. If people had tweeted something where they'd been critical, or if they'd said they were going to take some action, or try and form an NGO, or speak to Western NGOs or the media, that was the trigger for decisive action to be taken against them, and used to send out a very chilling message to their friends and others around them, don't do the same thing. And it certainly has had that effect. The level of criticism has decreased inside because of that brutal crackdown. It's also meant that those outside, family members, have to be very careful about what they say, because the bargaining chip is their loved one inside, locked up, and they're able to use that as a way of trying to silence any opposition throughout the world. Even them saying that they have an international lawyer like myself trying to act on their behalf, if that became known who they were, that could have a disastrous effect. So a lot of the time in this area, you're acting on behalf of clients you can't even name, but you're trying to protect them as best you can. Just having a lawyer saying, can something be done, could mean that they are in an even worse position. So that's one particular case which follows right through into this recent report that Elena Kennedy has done, because a number of those families have again provided information about what happened to their family members, and the fact that they're now on death row, the report has identified at least 24 who are at imminent risk, and there may be more as well. And it can suddenly increase because threats are made as they were recently, and then they could be carried out without anyone knowing. The second case that I wanted to highlight is one involving a number of the female activists and feminists who were detained throughout this period and thereafter as well, and have continued up until this day. Obviously, a focus of the detentions was the notorious lifting of the driving ban of women, when all those who had campaigned for it were arrested before that was announced. I mean, together with a number of other female activists as well. I have been acting for two South African women who were detained, not as part of the activist movement. They were teachers there in Saudi Arabia. They'd gone there to work from South Africa, to get work, to send back money to their families. And they were detained completely out of the blue, extraordinarily, with their brothers, four, in a coordinated operation in different locations, all rounded up and put in prison without knowing what was going on. It's a significant case because of what happened to them. And these were outsiders who got caught up in the system, which shows that anybody is vulnerable going there. But also because they were detained and were in prison around the same time as a number of the Saudi female activists were passing through and staying there. They were, fortunately, the South African detainees, given a fairly special status and not tortured physically, certainly abused psychologically, and enormous pressure put on them to sign confessions, admit to all kinds of things that they hadn't done. But what they witnessed was the Saudi woman in the same prison, the Dakhban prison, one of the well-known ones, being treated appallingly, where they were tortured, where they were taken out of the prison to other places outside and abused. And they are able to give first-hand accounts of what they saw inside. They were finally released mainly through pressure from the outside, interventions from the South African government, fortunately. But in the case of one of them, only after 3 years of being in detention, only in the end being charged with some vague cybercrime as a way of covering up, but just lost 3 years of her life without knowing anything about why she was there. The other sister was released with no charges whatsoever. And what's striking again about their case is how little they knew about actually what was going on, or anybody knew about why they were there. They just kept having their detention renewed. They kept having to go through this day in and day out, the uncertainty of not knowing when they would be released, if they would be released, knowing that others were being tortured around them. Was it going to happen to them? I mean, overwhelming psychological pressure, and being interviewed about all kinds of things that they hadn't been involved in at all, whether they would sign some confession to try and allow them to get out. And in the end, none of it was used against them. They were fortunately released and are able now to try and campaign for recognition from the Saudi authorities that what they did was wrong. They've never got any acknowledgement or apology, any compensation at all. But most importantly, as they always emphasized to me, and in fact they came here to the UN Human Rights Council during the last session and gave evidence about what had happened to them, mainly to be a vehicle for highlighting those who are still in detention, the other female detainees, activists, feminists who are there, who have been treated appallingly, and where there's no hope of when they're ever going to be released. You know, many of them are on trial at the moment. They've complained about being tortured, and may well end up in a situation where they could also face the death penalty. So their case, a very important one, because it highlights how completely uncertain and arbitrary the system was. Without them knowing from day to day what was going to happen, it seemed that even the people who were holding them didn't know. instructions had come from above, they had to be kept there, and they were never going to see the light of day unless they cooperated. And if there hadn't been outside pressure, they might still be there today. And they keep highlighting, and this is what I want to end off to underline, that without that outside pressure from their government and other governments, fortunately, yes, they were foreigners, but they would have never been released, let alone the women who are in there still, who are from Saudi Arabia. And their plea over and over again, which they stressed when they came here, is make sure that this is put on the agenda all the time, that the Saudi authorities know, that other people know they're not going to stop banging on the door about this, because that was the only way out for them, and it's the only way out for the others as well, and those in particular who face the death penalty. So their plea was, yes, we know it's complicated, it's the UN, there's all kinds of elaborate trade deals going on between countries, they have to operate in a friendly, cooperative environment, but there comes a point at which, when you know the evidence about what's happening, when they've seen it firsthand, that you have to take a stance on these things, be more blatant, more robust in challenging the Saudi authorities, and collectively looking to ensure that these practices are halted. If it means taking steps like putting pressure around the G20 summit, other diplomatic pressure, other sanctions, those must be adopted. Of course, in a constructive way to try and get a positive result, not just randomly or to punish, but in a way which will bring a halt to these violations. That's their enduring plea from the clients directly, from the cells directly, and I hope that that can continue to be heard and passed around the halls here for all states to take very seriously, and not to, at the end of the day, let them down. We need to be all able to hold our heads up high and say, yes, we did everything we could. And if we do that, I think we will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you. We're over time, but no one's knocking on the door. So if anybody has any questions for the panel or wants to raise a comment or an observation, please feel free to do so.
Thank you for this great panel. I'm Duad Haini from the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights. I just want to ask one question regarding the accountability and how can we know that this violation may stop. For example, Saudi Arabia had executed all these people that we are talking about in April, and before that, the mass execution in 2016, even though it was a member of the Human Rights Council. This is the last session for Saudi Arabia as a member of the Human Rights Council. Okay, when it was a member, we couldn't do anything. Can we now? Could the Council do anything to accountable it, or is it just more international or more media pressure?
Well, I will attempt to say something. To change a culture is always difficult, and it's a combination of pressures which needs to be made through all the means available. It's very important, I think, that the Human Rights Council is encouraged to examine the record of the Saudi Arabian government, its member. I mean, it's not the Human Rights Council isn't just there to look at the rest of the world. Its own members too need to be such that other countries would respect their human rights opinions. So it's very important for each national government to ask its own member on the Human Rights Council to apply to Saudi Arabia the same standards that they would apply to any country that they examine. And then, of course, there are There are national representations. I have already mentioned the other United Nations human rights bodies. It's very important that every national representative on these bodies gets a very clear message from their own public back home, either through the Parliament or through the media, that it is their responsibility to make representations which really put the spot on, because as I think the United Nations is also equipped to advise and to help the Saudi Arabian government to improve its procedures. It has a wealth of human rights expertise. So it's just necessary to pull the trigger and let it go. Everyone who's in a position of influence and power should be asked to do something.
I just add that for me it's just simply unacceptable for other countries, not just for the Human Rights Council, but for other countries who respect the rule of law and the primacy of human rights, to do nothing and to say nothing. So the responsibility is just wider than this Palais and the Human Rights Council and the UN institutions. It's countries that trade, that do business with Saudi Arabia, that have engagements with Saudi Arabia. There's a responsibility on all partners to raise these issues. To do nothing is unacceptable, I would say, in the face of the information that is now available.
Hi, just a quick comment on the point that you've just made, and two questions. I'm going to ask you to speculate, in fact, nothing to do with the report per se. But the quick comment, is just in respect to the G20, that if the appeals and the calls, of course, for action, for some sort of governmental response to something, if it really meant something, I think we might see a bit of a kickback about the G20 at least sometime before it's actually held. So that's my comment. Just to pick up on, I was intrigued by the notion that Juliet Wells raised about the disappearance of the remains of the victims, of course, famously in the Khashoggi case, but also in those that were executed in April, the mass executions. And I'd just like to ask maybe all of you to speculate briefly, what does it mean psychologically, judicially, socially, when a state does not return the remnants, the remains, for that closure that Juliet Wells referred to? So I just wonder if you could just unpack that a little bit. The second question that I'm going to ask you to speculate on, we've mentioned, I think it might be in the report, I've not read it yet, the mass executions, last one in April, were overwhelmingly of those who took part in protests. They were Shia. And I just wonder, in the context of an unfair judicial system that lacks the transparency that you've set out, in that context, where there's such a preponderance number of people who are of a minority, how does that feed into a discourse of worsening sectarianization that worsens social division?
Thank you. I was saying I'll happily come back on the first point about what it really means for a society and legally. I think you were saying for remains to be disappeared and to stay disappeared. I already mentioned sort of what Zainab said, although that was, of course, in the context of not knowing whether her brother was yet alive or dead, not knowing to refer to him as was or is. But is that same sense of limbo, of lack of closure, that Baroness Kennedy also referred to in her opening remarks, and that her teacher spoke about very eloquently when she addressed the council earlier this year. In terms of social cost, of course, when this is happening on a systematic scale and when it is targeted at a minority populace, it is that sense of grief and of aggrievement writ large. In terms of what it means legally or judicially, of course, each person who is affected in that way is having their Article 3 rights, their rights to religious freedom impinged on. But I think there's something qualitatively a bit more to it than that. So if we think about, well, for example, mass disappearances in South America in the course of the last century, or if we think about perhaps a little closer to this particular subject, the events which set in train the legal thinking and the drafting which ultimately produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, what I'm referring to here is really the Holocaust and the disappearance of victims on a mass scale and the total non-observance of, and deliberately so, of their religious rights, both R-I-G-H-T and R-I-T-E-S. There is something almost uncleanly offensive about denying people the right to say goodbye to their loved ones and to be buried in accordance with their own religious customs as they want to be, and for society at large to not know where the bodies are buried. It's an extraordinary practice, to my mind, and it's something which should be taken very seriously, but particularly when it's happening on such a widespread scale.
I would just add briefly that in relation to the first matter, yes, obviously it's callous, cold-hearted, but I think there's a clear reason behind it. These things aren't done just for the fact that there's an evil streak in human nature. I mean, it's there in order to stigmatize people and to serve as a very strong indication that no dissent will be tolerated. And I think that leads into the second part as well, which is that this is all about the maintenance of complete power at all levels in that society and beyond. And that any potential divisions that can be used to weaken and sow dissent and ultimately crack that ruling bloc and the resources that it has access to is just not going to be tolerated. And that's the strategy that's been adopted. I mean, states look to hold power in different ways. This is one of the extreme ways, and that's the way that has been used for a long time. It's going to continue to be used unless it's challenged, obviously from within, but fundamentally from outside.
And just to add to that, if one looks at the small clump of states that continue to execute, as I mentioned in the introduction, there was only 20 states that carried out the death penalty last year. In all of those states, the claim is the death penalty is not a human rights issue, it's a matter of criminal justice policy. The other 160 states that haven't used the death penalty at all, have abolished it, or haven't carried out an execution for more than 10 years, completely accept that the death penalty is totally ineffective criminal justice policy, and that the death penalty historically has been used as a tool of repression. It's targeted not only on minorities, but it's targeted on vulnerable and marginalized groups, however you want to describe that. It could be people who are economically deprived. But that is the real history of capital punishment, and this is totally evident in Saudi Arabia, how they target the death penalty. As Rod said, it's a tool of repression, but it is also targeted against certain sectors of society. So the answer to your question is it can only worsen divisions in a society, but the ultimate aim is to keep control of power, and that is not unique to Saudi Arabia. That is what the death penalty really is all about. But it is a very, very strong example of this practice.
And to that, I'd just add that it's no coincidence that it is the Shia minority population in the eastern provinces who were most heavily involved in the Arab Spring. The two dovetail in exactly the way that Rod is saying.
Yes.
My name is Minna from my association. I just want to add a comment on the role of the Human Rights Council, even with Saudi Arabia member of the council. I see like most of the Gulf countries region, member of the Human Rights Council violates human rights and nothing in return. I see the report of the MIS rapporteur on extrajudicial executions also sent to the Human Rights Council on her views on the Jamal Khashoggi case and nothing in return. So what do you see as a reform in the Human Rights Council to this part? Thank you.
I can't disagree with you, but of course the members of the Human Rights Council themselves have a responsibility. As you say, they don't all assume this responsibility very ardently, but it is incumbent on them to make something of these reports and to fulfill their task. And as I mentioned earlier, the countries which send them there have a parliament whose job is to hold the government to account. It's important to keep on asking questions, to say, why hasn't this been taken up? Why hasn't something been done? I can't say that a complex and faction-riven organization, if I could put it like that, will change overnight. But there is only one way to do it, and that is to keep on at it.
Do we have any more comments or questions? Okay, well, I'd like to wrap up now. We've gone way over time. I'd like very much to thank our panel. Thank you very much for what was a very interesting, important, and at times quite troubling conversation about gross human rights violations that I think we're all very concerned about. I'd also like to thank the people that have supported us. I'd like to thank Baroness Helena Kennedy, whose report is really the centerpiece for today's event. And I'd also like to thank Abdullah Al-Oda for taking the time to give us his account, his personal testimony based on the situation pertaining to his father. And thank you all very much for coming today.